Hello, and welcome to a special series called Empowering the Truth. As you can see on your screens, this is brought to you by the International Center for Journalists, also known as ICFJ. And this is brought to you in association with us. That is, we are Boom Fact Check. We're found at boomlive.in. And my name is HR Venkatesh, and I'm the Director of Training and Research at Boom. Today, we have a super exciting speaker who you can see on the screen right now. I will introduce him very shortly. I'll just say his name, which you all know because you're registered. His name is Rajneil Kamath. And the topic that he's going to be speaking on is how one can build networks and what use really are networks and alliances for journalists and fact checkers and organizations. But before we get into that, here is a quick reminder of what this series of conversations and workshops are all about. Starting today, every Thursday now, in March, we're going to be bringing you 4 speakers, each of them really speaking about relevant topics related to countering misinformation and disinformation. And by countering misinformation and disinformation, what we are really trying to do is give you reliable information as well. So we'll tell you what the next speakers in this series. Next week, we have Sudipto Mandal. He's going to be talking about how to reach the unreachable, how to talk to underrepresented audiences. He comes in as in his capacity as executive editor as the News Minute. But before we get into everything else, we'll also tell you now that the it's a good time to tell you about a chance to win a grant from ICFJ. How do you win this grant? Well, for starters, you have to attend at least 3 of the next 4 sessions. That is, if you're attending today's session, you've got to attend today and at least 2 more. That is, at least in the next few Thursdays to be able to qualify for this grant. And this is actually the second year we are doing this. So we did exactly this last year. We brought you 5 speakers. And you will see shortly on your screen all these 5 speakers. We had Dr. Masato Kajimoto, then we had Sohini Guha-Roy, who spoke about social audiences. We had Mano and Sanshay talking about mobile video for truth telling. Then we had Amit Verma talking about how to get started on podcasting. Then we brought you the last 2, which were Rishad Patel on design for journalists, and we wrapped it all up with Alan Soon talking about strategic communication. So this whole thing was last year's programming. This year, we bring you an equally exciting lineup. And I think this is a good time to introduce our speaker. Thank you so much, Rajneil, for joining us. I'll give you a chance to say hello in a second, but let me do an intro. Rajneil is the founder of News Checker. It's a fact-checking initiative found in multiple languages. They operate in multiple Indian languages. He's also the co-founder of The Signal. And before this, he spent 5 years working for Google as part of several teams in ad, content moderation, sales, and public policy. He's also gone on to found several companies, Glance, R2D2, RT Media Tech. But for the purposes of this talk, the hat that he's going to wear is as the acting vice president of the Misinformation Combat Alliance. And he's the person who's really running that. And we're going to talk about a little bit about that. Rajneil, before I hand it over to you, I'm going to first say yes, hello, and hope, that the next hour that we'll be able to really plunge deep into the idea of networks and alliances. And I'm going to hand the floor open to you, and we'll talk a little bit more about alliances and networks. We'll do a Q&A, and we'll also take questions from the audience. But it's over to you now, Rajneil.
Hi, HR. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me be a part of this discussion. It's wonderful to be here. And it's wonderful to talk to HR about networks and alliances because he is somebody who's actually the OG of trying to do that in India. And I've obviously picked from his footsteps and learned a lot from his footsteps in trying to get fact checkers together through to the MCA and do work through that. So thanks once again and look forward to having this conversation and any questions that you may have.
That's fantastic. Why don't I start off with a couple of questions, and then the floor is entirely yours, and then we'll come back and finish off with a few questions. And this is a reminder for everybody here who has joined us that you can put in your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box. And you can start asking your questions right now, because you might be thinking, okay, this is very interesting, like alliances and networks, but what's in it for me as a journalist? What's in it for me as a fact checker? So we'll probably also talk about how one can build a career in this sort of thing a little later in this conversation. So hold on to that thought and start writing in the questions. I just want to quickly introduce as well. In this chat, we have Divya Chandra and Tita Ghosh. They're both my colleagues at Boom, and they'll be handling the chat box and the Q&A box, and we'll be putting in relevant information there. So watch out for that. Rajneil, I would say, that when it comes to alliances and networks, specifically in the misinformation space, we had the Ekta News Coalition, which I founded. Okay, then we've had the next version, which is the Misinformation Combat Alliance. Right, we've had these two. We are going to talk about the Misinformation Combat Alliance. We also have recently announced something called Shakti as part of the work that all us fact checkers are doing. So there's a lot to talk about alliances and networks, but I just want you to kick things off by talking about, okay, this is specifically in India, but for the rest of the world, this is not a new thing. We've been around for about 10 years in terms of alliances and networks. We have had, of course, the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. These were collaborations in investigative journalism, and they were multi-country collaborations, and they took many years to execute. We've had investigations also from OCCRP and the Global Investigative Journalism Network. So we've had one type of that. Then we've had election-related collaborations, right? Such as Check Facta in Indonesia and Verificado in Mexico. And these are the examples that we bring out pretty much every time. But there's a lot more happening in this space. There was an alliance, of course, in the Philippines before the elections there, before this year. And then, of course, we've had several attempts to have collaborations in India. I mentioned ICTA. We're talking about Misinformation Combat Alliance, but we've also had other reporters, coming together and doing these kinds of collaborations. So that's kind of like the background. So I want you to just take us through where you're at and what you have to say.
Yeah. Typically, I think when you think of networks or collaborations, and when it actually happens, it shows the maturing of an ecosystem from its infancy to reaching a level where you're actually comfortable to actually work with each other, collaborate with each other, understand where you can complement each other, understand what your strengths and weaknesses are, and come together to kind of ensure that it's only strengths and very little weaknesses. With the Misinformation Combat Alliance, it's set up as a Section 8 not-for-profit company under the Companies Act of 2013. We had 9 founding members, and currently that membership number stands at 16. Of that, 12 are fact checkers, 3 media companies, and 1 civic tech organization. We were registered in 21. We became public in 2022. Really with 3 pillars in mind, and sometimes that 3 is also 4 depending on the kind of activities that we are doing. And those pillars were, the first one was media and digital literacy. How do we help a population that was getting online? How do we improve their trust in information and also build resilience to misinformation? And both things, right? The next pillar we had was technology intervention. How can we build tools and products that would help the ecosystem in the work that they are doing, make it readily and easily accessible to all? The third one was community and capacity building. How do you build communities around fact checking and adjacent areas, as well as improving their capacity so they're able to do their work in a much better manner and enable sharing of learnings with each other in a sense, right? That was that. And the fourth one was advocacy, which was being able to collectively arrive at viewpoints that we could advocate for the benefit of the ecosystem. So those were the 4 key pillars with which we came up. And I think the thinking there was, individually as organizations, we only have certain pockets of influence or certain pockets of reach, which is very small in comparison to the overall cyberverse that we find in this country. And then you can extend that globally. If you want to have a larger impact, the only way that's possible is when you come together and work together as a grouping. And that was the key insight we had when we thought of the MCA. And that's when we started reaching out to organizations and saying, how can we come together? How can we solve some of these challenges that we have? Um, and a lot of organizations, obviously, it's signs of a maturing ecosystem, right? Realized that, yes, we're doing the work that we do, but we definitely need to work with each other as well if we ourselves want to grow and have a larger impact. And that is how the MCA came apart. But I think what really sparked that was in 2020 when COVID was going on. I was living in Noida at the time in a gated complex, which was, 10 buildings, about 25 floors and multiple apartments in each of these floors. And suddenly I found myself being added to a Telegram group and a WhatsApp group. And then people telling me why I should ban the vessel because it creates a particular frequency which will actually lead to the coronavirus dying. And I was like, that's not true. But more importantly, I just moved in here. So how did you get my details to add me to these apartment complex groups, right? So I started reverse engineering that to see I've not interacted with anybody. It's COVID. You can barely go out. So there was no interaction at all. Yet it seemed like I was connected to everybody in the apartment complex. And I realized it was through one of these apps which are used for managing gated communities. So I reached out to the founder of that app and I said, I think people are using your app to congregate on messaging apps. They're getting details about other residents and are creating these groups. And there seems to be a lot of information which is not correct floating through these apps. At that time, that app also said, yeah, we've noticed there's a problem because we are also getting added to these groups and we don't know what to do about it. So could your organization come and help us be a part of these groups and help demystify some of the myths they have regarding COVID? And it started off as that partnership. And then we realized that we were getting requests from residents in different parts of the country saying, is this advisory true? Or are schools really going to be open day after tomorrow in the city where I'm living? Because there seems to be an announcement, right? And that is the time when lockdowns were announced, lockdowns were lifted, you would go back into a lockdown. So there was a lot of confusion about what kind of establishments could operate. Uh, could gyms operate? Could schools operate? Could offices reopen? Is it going to be work from home? And it was that learning that sometimes when you want to debunk misinformation, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that fact checkers are doing. It can also be in other properties where people tend to meet up, congregate, have discussions. And that was a realization that on our own we can't solve this problem. We have to collaborate and work with others.
Okay, that's yeah, that's quite an interesting genesis tale, and it's funny. I haven't lived in any apartment for a long time in India, but I know instinctively how the apartments are and how you know. So it's interesting. Now, so this is the genesis of MCA. Now, I want you to think about it from the other end, from the perspective of a journalist or a fact checker, right? Why should a fact checker or a journalist, or maybe an interested individual, someone who's interested in elevating good signals, right? So that could be anybody it could be a researcher, it could be an interested individual. How is an alliance or a network like MCA? How will it affect their lives? And then we can talk about so that is one question. In fact, I think that's a slightly more nuanced question that I will get into a little later to give you a little bit of time to think about it as well. But I want you to like put on your hat of someone who's as an observer in this scene as well, and talk a little bit about, why do we need networks among journalists? One thing I've often heard is we journalists tend to be competitors, right? So, I got this news report before the other person did. I broke the story. That's the term we use. Whether we're journalists or whether we're publishers, we're all about competition. But in the last few years, we've also increasingly been about collaboration. And so maybe in some senses, collaboration is better than competition. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think specifically from the fact checking ecosystem, what we've realized is you'd rather get it right than get it first, where you're actually prioritizing accuracy over speed. And in many cases, when you look at India as a country, we have so many states, so many languages. It's extremely diverse. what you see as misinformation in one language or specific to one region may not be the same in another part of the country. I mean, think of how different Tamil Nadu is in comparison to Punjab. Uh, Now, many fact checkers who are there in this space may have fact checking operations in Tamil, but not necessarily fact checking operations in Punjab or vice versa, right? What happens then when you actually come across some information which you're trying to verify and don't have the right sourcing or methodology in that state to be able to do it? This is when you want to lean on a network to say, we don't have fact checkers there, but you do. Could you help us verify this piece of information? Because at the end of the day, our objective is the same. We want to combat misinformation. We don't want to leave any information vacuums that could lead to the proliferation of misinformation in some way. So you'd rather then work with somebody who's already there on ground to be able to quickly verify that for you. And I think that to me has been a very big learning, that it's not about competing anymore only to break it first. You also want to be accurate, because trust is what people are coming to you for. They trust that what you're saying is accurate, it's correct, and therefore you don't want to break it by being the first one to do it. And in many cases, when you can't, it's better to work with somebody else than let that be completely free. I think that's one. There is a lot of learning that tends to happen in terms of uh, knowing about somebody's experiences, knowing about somebody's what they're actually doing on ground. Like when I came into the ecosystem, I was extremely new to this, so I have only learned from other people. I have only learned about their contexts, their regions, their politics in those regions, and why it matters, right? So many times when I now look at things, it's easier for me to look at to be like, oh yeah, this is bound to happen here, but I won't expect that to happen there. And networks kind of give you that ability to bring all of that together, which would otherwise be very disparate efforts. And I think that's where the benefit really is. It builds a community, it brings like-minded people together. It allows you to work with each other. It allows you to also form friendships. It's not just working relationships, but also friendships, which you'd really cherish. And I genuinely do within this ecosystem.
Yeah, as they say, um, collaboration is about mathematics of bringing people together, but it's also about chemistry, right? And getting people together also makes you hopefully like those people, more. So that was interesting. So okay, so that's why collaboration works over competition. And of course, this is something that if you spend more than like 5 or 10 years as a journalist, one would know that this is not how journalists typically operate, but that is formally, but informally, journalists have always cooperated. They've always given each other their contacts and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So can we?
So,
Yes.
yeah, one of the context is I'm not a, I didn't have formal training as a journalist. I don't write. I came from a policy and marketing background. So I often also bring in a hat that's not, um, I work in this very weird combination, which tries to bring policy, marketing, content, languages together. And it's in the times that we are in, it's an important combination to have because they are really intersecting in a very big way. So how do we also bring in those that expertise and give people the larger picture context? Because sometimes at work you get very myopic about, this is my day, this is what I need to do, and then get done at the end of the day. And these are my goals for the quarter and my goals for the year. But you may also want to look at the larger picture, and that's where alliances and networks really help.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Rajneil, because I just realized that being a journalist myself, I tend to assume that everybody who counters disinformation is a journalist, but absolutely not. It's in fact people on the policy side, people on the technology side, people on the business side, people in your research foundations or universities, people even in various arms of the government, right? So we have people from all over trying to fight counter disinformation. And so I think on behalf, I mean, I was going to ask you a little bit more about alliance building and specifically what the MCA does, but I think I'm going to sort of take off on what you said. So it's pretty established. How does one become a fact checker? Well, you apply to join a fact checker. If you're already a journalist, that helps, but you don't need to be a journalist. You can start off afresh from college, right? And you can build a career as a fact checker. And from there, you can explore adjacencies, right? From being a fact checker. But I'm assuming you can equally become someone who fights disinformation from a multiple other um, professions or professional qualifications. Um I believe you graduated from a university, the SRCC, Sri Ram College of Commerce, which, if you're Indian, you will know it has a certain reputation for only taking students who qualify with a very high cutoff mark. But maybe talk a little bit about what kinds of qualifications you really need if you want to counter disinformation and you don't necessarily want to be a journalist.
Yeah. So Sriram College of Commerce only has commerce and economics. They're currently known for having a cutoff of 100%. I'm fortunate that I didn't live in that era where you had to get 100%, so it was a lot easier getting into SRCC for me at least. But when you're, as you rightly mentioned, when you're thinking of mis and disinformation, there are multiple ways of looking at it. As a fact checker, you're probably at the front lines of trying to debunk misinformation as and when you come across it and you want to set the record straight. But depending on where you sit, you could be a person who's working in a tech company trying to build products that are able to catch early signals of misinformation. So you could be a engineer, for example, doing that. You could be somebody who works in the humanities stream or in the legal stream, and you're now looking to build policies for a platform which decide what to do when you come across mis or disinformation. How should you treat it? What should your enforcement be on the platform? Uh, you could be a researcher who's trying to understand what are the persuasion techniques that misinformation that content tends to have, which can mislead people, right? Uh, you could be somebody who's in the marketing stream and saying, does marketing campaigns, and we've now seen one in India with which apparently said an actress had died. Um, I'm not sure if I should call her an actress or a model or an influencer, but assuming that she's all of them, that she had died because of I think it was cervical cancer. And then the next day she came back and said, no, no, I'm alive, but I'm here to create awareness about cervical cancer and the HPV vaccine. It definitely did create awareness, but does it mean that you had to put out misinformation to create that kind of awareness? So you're now the onus is also on marketing agencies and PR professionals on what is the ethical way of doing PR and campaigns. How much of awareness versus how much of misleading are you? I mean, it's funny that people think that awareness and being misled can now be two sides of the same coin. If being misled leads to some kind of awareness, which is overall positive, it's an equation we didn't have to think about earlier, but now we do. So now you also have to, if you're somebody in marketing or PR, you have to think about it as much. If you're a if you're a government official today, you've got to understand how information can lead to. I mean, it can also cause a lot of problems, right? Whether it's kidnapping rumors, whether it's what we've now seen has led to rumors about migration, which has led to an exodus from certain cities. So even if you're a public official, you have to understand how, one is catching it at the right time and what are the risk and mitigation techniques you must have in place to address that. So it really needs people from uh, different backgrounds, different professions to actually come together. Even fact checking is one piece when you think of the entire mis and disinformation information ecosystem that's there. You might want to have educators who think media literacy is the way going forward. And in many ways, when your mission is to combat mis and disinformation, you actually have to bring all of this together. And that's where, again, networks play a role.
Okay, so there are multiple entry points into building a career towards this kind of thing. Okay, so quick question about quick two, three questions really about the Misinformation Combat Alliance. You mentioned you have a few different verticals. You mentioned a technology intervention vertical. We have we're all talking about generative AI. We're all talking about deep fakes. We're talking about we've had narrow fakes or cheap fakes. right? We've had Photoshop. So it seems like the world of technology enabled disinformation keeps evolving really rapidly. So is there something that you believe and something like an MCA could do to deal with that?
I mean, typically what we've seen is every mode of communication which has led to mass communication has brought with it a wave of mis and disinformation. We're living at a time which is hyper connected in the age of the internet, which is now another platform through which mis and disinformation spreads. Most recently, we've seen generative AI not just making text articles, but also images, audio notes, as well as videos. And in some ways, the job of a fact checker is changing from not informing the public about what is not true, but also telling them that a piece of content is indeed true. And we've seen that, for example, in terms of what was happening in West Asia and saying, no, no, that plume of smoke is not AI generated, or that baby that you see is not a doll, or it's not inserted into the image, it's actually real. And increasingly, we're reaching this stage where seeing is not believing, because you can see it, you can hear it, but it may not necessarily be something that actually happened, or a person who was in it may have actually said or done something. Towards that, the MCA is working on the deepfakes analysis unit, which we hope will be a central resource for the public and a trusted resource to escalate any content they come across, which they believe could have some element of AI, primarily images and video, to a WhatsApp number that we will be making public very soon. And on the other side, we're building a network of academics, researchers, startups, digital forensic labs, um, technology providers who are all working on trying to detect synthetic media and bring all their expertise together along with fact checkers to provide assessments on whether a piece of content is real or has some element of synthetic media or AI generated media. Uh, we made the announcement about this a little over a week ago, and we're looking to go live sometime later this year.
Right. I sorry, I don't know if you had an audio issue or not, but I'm going to take this moment to remind everyone to kind of start asking your questions. Remember, there's no such thing as a bad question or a stupid question, because sometimes the most basic questions yield the most interesting answers. So please start asking your questions. Rajneil, I'm assuming you were not interrupted, and maybe it was just a blip in my at my end of the screen. Okay, so we were talking about the deepfake analysis unit, and I also want to ask you a little bit about some of the other verticals within the Misinformation Combat Alliance, but I'll come to that a little later. A question that I realize that the audience might might also appreciate, perhaps, is that a little bit more in terms of context. We were living in an era of an open web, right? But slowly we've seen that the experience for people on the internet and on mobile phones is changing continent by continent. If you live in Europe, for example, the GDPR rules make it so that technology companies are forced to do certain things, and it's generally seen as a good thing. If you live in the US, you have a different experience. And of course, if you live in India, you have a different experience. Live in Southeast Asia and other countries in Southeast Asia or Central Asia or the Middle East, you have different experiences, right? So, would you say that organizations or groupings like the Misinformation Combat Alliance is increasingly a thing of the future because every geography needs to evolve its own response to policy and technology and that kind of thing? And so, from that perspective, would you also say then that it becomes a viable career?
I think what we're seeing globally is that different countries and different regions are having their own issues, their own contexts, their own histories, their own backgrounds. And in a lot of ways, while we were progressing towards globalization, we're now trying to be a lot more regional specific in that sense. So what we've globally seen at least is within Europe, there was the EFCSN, which is the European Fact-Checking Standards Network. We've seen, I think, LATAM Chequeado in South America. We've seen Africa Check in Africa. We've seen the Arab Fact-Checking Network for the Middle East. There's something coming up, to organize groups even in Southeast Asia, APAC and Southeast Asia. And of course, we obviously understand that at a larger level, a lot of our issues are common. We may have the same challenges, the same problems, and in many cases, the same solutions. But as you start going deeper into that, you realize that it will begin to change based on your regional nuances only because of the diversity, the culture, the history that you have. It may not be the same. Like what we recognize as challenges will be the same, but how you address them will differ from place to place, will differ on maybe, let's say, the structure of government that you see in some place. It could be the way different platforms might be popular. In India, of course, you might say that we're a country which pretty much lives on WhatsApp and YouTube now. In many other countries, they're not living on WhatsApp or YouTube. It's probably TikTok. If you look at the US, for example, 95% of the teenagers are now using iPhones and therefore iMessage and not necessarily WhatsApp. Each of these products, therefore, have different use cases, different usage patterns, and therefore different challenges. Now, for example, on WhatsApp in India, we all have not election tip lines, but fact checkers generally have tip lines where users can escalate a piece of content to get it verified and checked. But what would happen if you're in the US today and you've come across this piece of information on iMessage, but you don't know where to forward it? What happens then? Is that something that Apple is even thinking about? So a lot of these contexts change. And because people tend to know their regions and contexts the best, they are coming together to represent those things and speak to the same. I mean, one thing we've seen for common is maybe the companies are the same overall, or the platforms are same overall, but it may differ in usage. So how do these groupings come together to engage with platforms, to engage with other stakeholders? And that's probably the way forward. Can it be a career? Surely, because many of like the MCA is currently completely volunteer driven. It is actually members who are putting in their time and effort to do this. And most members are managing this with their own day jobs, with their own deliverables and pressures that they also have at work. So you will need people who will be able to run these alliances and learn to bring everyone together so it does not look like an additional burden, yet it becomes a part of what they do.
Got it. Got it. Okay, so you've given us a little bit of food for thought. We've also got a couple of questions. So what we'll do now is I'm going to read out these questions, Rajneil, and you can wear your technologist and publisher hat, and I can wear my journalistic hat and maybe add to your answer as well. And I'm going to give you a moment or two to think about these questions. Okay, so what we will do is Mohammed Noman, sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your last name right, says, hello, I'm a software engineer with a deep concern about the combination of misinformation and hate speech. While I've started fact checking a Telegram group, he says, I feel my contribution is not enough. How can I, as an individual, further contribute to combating misinformation and hate? So hold that thought. There's another question which I will read out in a bit. But we also want you all who are part of this conversation, this webinar, to quickly answer a poll, because when you answer a poll, and you can be as frank and as you want, it helps us as well. And this is, of course, something that ICFJ is also equally interested in, to understand what people's reactions are to the poll. So I think Divya or Titha will be dropping the poll in. Um, okay, and we have a third question as well by an
Okay.
anonymous attendee in the chat box, but we'll get to the questions. I also want to do a time check. We have about 25 minutes left, I think. So I think we'll just go to the poll. If you can see, the first poll is, please rate your knowledge before the session and after this session. Um, you just have to, it won't take much time. There are basically 5 questions. So it's very easy. It's not like a poll where you have to click on anything. Okay, so there are 3 questions. You know what, Rajneil, I'm going to go with anonymous attendees question first, actually. During elections, what are the challenges for fact checkers and how should he or she or they solve it? So, um, can you talk a little bit about the challenges ahead of fact checking organizations or fact checkers during elections, given that elections are imminent and they're going to be announced within a week, perhaps, right?
Yeah. I think typically what tends to happen is during elections, you will see a spike in misinformation. Whether it's state elections or whether it's general elections, there's always a spike. What we end up grappling is with the volume of misinformation that we see, the speed with which it's coming, and therefore our own abilities to see how much can we actually address. All the fact-checking newsrooms that we have are limited in number. So they're only able to address those many claims or those many pieces of content at a time. Very often, if you ask a fact checker, it will not be a function of if, but a function of when. It's not that we think of should that claim be fact checked. It's like we know we have to fact check it, but should we do it now, or is there an other claim that needs to be fact checked earlier? There was a study that was done which had about 24 parameters of assessing how to prioritize some of these claims, and it was basis on the basis of harm, on the basis of impact, and there were multiple criteria. uh, Parinima, who's one of the who represents Tattle, which is an MCA member, had also worked on it. And that's a great way for newsrooms to understand and see how do you prioritize which claims to check first. But in an ideal state, we'd want to check all. It's a function of what is the bandwidth, how quickly is something spreading, and how much of an impact we can make for that particular claim. And that's something you will see in terms of elections, right? Many times the claim will come out first, but fact checkers are going to try and be as quick as they can. What does that mean? During elections now, typically fact checkers move into election mode. So you might now, if a normal work day is 8 hours, now fact checking operations will be for 20 hours because teams will be working in shifts. There are no weekends for fact checkers during an election. Let's be very clear. It's not like we're slave drivers or we are trying to extract work. It's just that many fact checkers understand the role that they have to play in an election. And the idea is to then create a roster where some people are also working on weekends, so some people can take rest. We understand that fact checkers are also seeing a lot of content which is unpalatable and not meant to be on the internet in any case, right? It can have its own impact, especially on mental health. So how do you ensure that you're not burning a fact checker out is another thing that fact checking organizations are constantly thinking about and planning their operations in such a way that there is round the clock coverage. This is something that we did because Bangladesh went into elections. It was the first election this year, the first weekend, in fact, of 2024. And the scale at which videos were coming in, you suddenly had to increase your team just to be able to review that much content. And in many cases, also push back and say, this is unverified. Please do not let your platforms or your algorithms amplify it. So it's a lot of that because you again have multiple stakeholders here who you need to work with. One of the things that the MCA is doing is it's partnered with data leads and the Google News Initiative on Project Shakti, which is trying to bring fact checkers along with publishers together to work in identifying narratives, claims, trends, and to ensure there's cross posting of fact checks so it reaches a wider audience. There
Got
are a lot
it.
more things on elections, but this is a nutshell.
Okay. We can come back to it if time permits. Let's get to Mohammed's question. Just to repeat, he's a software engineer, very worried about misinformation and hate speech, has started fact checking a Telegram group, but he feels his contribution is not enough. How can he, as an individual, further contribute to combating misinformation and hate?
Yeah. Firstly, I think Mama's doing a great job of taking the initiative to actually look into this Telegram group and doing his bit. And we must always remember that it is drops of water that ultimately make an ocean. Uh, Many times we often feel the same way about the work that we do, that we are not doing enough. But then the other way to look at it is, if I wasn't doing it, is that still okay? And that's when you realize that even that small impact you make is actually a very large impact when your base is zero. So please don't think that you're not doing anything. As an engineer, some of the projects that the MCA works on is open source. We're always looking for people who can help us and work with us. Uh, Tattle, which is a member who's helping us with the DAU, is also has a very large volunteer network of engineers, of academics, of researchers. You can reach out to them, or I'd be happy to connect you to them as well. And those are some ways in which you can also use your expertise in helping the larger community as a whole.
Great. Very well put, Rajneil. I want to add to what you said. There is a book by Greta Thunberg, which I think is called "No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference." So whatever you're doing, you're making a difference already. And we're also in this era where we recognize that small things make massive differences. And I would say, specifically in terms of advice, I would say fact checking is sometimes not enough, right? You can fact check a Telegram group, but what you could also do is switch tactics and go the media literacy route. What is the difference between media literacy and fact checking? Well, one way I like to think about it is fact checking is all about looking for answers, finding facts, right? But in many cases, the misinformation is does not clearly follow the, this is false kind of thing. It's a little bit of false with a little bit of truth, or it's a little bit of, information that's been twisted. So how do you deal with that? You can't fact check it, right? So what you can do is learn to ask, or, by your own example, ask the members of that Telegram group to start asking questions. So that's the difference between media literacy and fact checking. Fact checking is about finding answers. Media literacy is really, if you think about it, learning to ask intelligent questions, learning to think, okay, what is this source? Should I trust the source? Okay, what about the bias of this individual? And when I say bias, I don't mean bias as we use as a term that we use commonly, but as a scientific kind of principle that we all talk about these days. In the last, again, since 2011 at least, we've been talking about it, which is cognitive bias or unconscious bias or implicit bias. If you're interested, Mohammed, write into either of us, write into Rajneil. Rajneil, or News Checker, which is a good, how does one get in touch with you?
So is this chat available to everybody? I can type in my ID there.
I think so, yeah. So
Oh,
you
okay.
type in your ID,
Yeah.
reach out a little directly to Rajneil if you feel like, and reach out to me as well. We at Boom, we do something called story checks. Okay, so a story check is essentially aimed at this difficult question of what to do when you need to fact check and you need to do something else. So we'll leave it at that. I'll put in my email ID as well there. Let's go to the next question. I think there are about 4 or 5 questions. Let's get them all in, and then we'll wrap it up at this point. Okay, so next question by anonymous attendee. I'm going to take, what is the future of fact checkers after elections? After the election bump is over, if the funding stops, can fact checking units function independently?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question, right? I think we often assume that once elections are over, there will be lesser misinformation, but that isn't necessarily the case, because we're living in a fast-paced world where a lot of things are happening. And given how hyper-connected we are today, there's information flowing around, and a lot of it is not always correct. Uh, Funding is often a challenge when it comes to fact checkers. Uh, Many of us are trying different models for sustainability to see how we can continue our operations, even if those we work with decide not to go ahead with some of the programs that they may have. I'll be honest and say we've not completely figured it out. I think we're all trying very hard. As you may acknowledge, running a media company itself is quite hard. Not all media companies uh, tend to make money. Fact checking would be a subset of that. But we're definitely looking at different ways to sustain and keep our operations going. Uh, I don't have a very specific answer, because different fact checkers are doing different things to think about it. We are also thinking of a whole bunch of things. One of the things the MCA is trying to do is collectively work on some of these opportunities to support fact-checking newsrooms to be able to do their work.
Okay, that's great. Right. Three questions. Sabina Rahman says, given that technology, communication, and information dissemination are inevitable, rapid, routine, are risks associated with media literacy becoming increasingly monetized rather than, say, a public service? Okay, so this is an interesting question. How do we balance journalism's ethical responsibilities with tapping into, like, running fact checking as a business? And it's always a good question to ask. So let's see if you can attempt that. But I'm going to give you some time to think about it, Rajneil. Um, what are the I also want to say that we have about 13 minutes now, and so we will probably end it with these three questions that we have, because we might have a few announcements as well. Uh, what are the topics? Anonymous attendee asks, what are the topics, things we should avoid fact checking? That's a tricky one.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
No,
so
but you should.
I'll ask you to tackle that, and then maybe I'll add a little bit
Yeah.
about that as well.
I don't think you should avoid fact checking anything. If it's misinformation that can lead to harm, if it's misinformation that can lead to some kind of trouble, I think it needs to be checked. And let me give an example. Early in the day, many fact checkers would assume that anything to do with entertainment is not serious enough to be fact checked, right? It's gossipy in nature. It's the nature of entertainment, for example, right? You'd assume that some celebrity's PR team is leaking this. They want to be in the news, all of that. And that really went out of the window when the Sushant Singh Rajput case happened. That's when I think many fact checkers woke up and said, you can ignore it, but there were trends that were going live every day about how he was apparently alive, how he was apparently the inventor of a game, how some actor was actually behind the cause of uh, his sad demise. And you would say that, hey, entertainment, hands off, right? That's one. You might look at some claims which you think are too ridiculous to even invest your time, right? Can coconut water cure cancer, for example? I mean, the obvious answer you would also know, but the cost of not doing it is that many people may believe in it and not undertake the treatments which they should be undertaking. So you also have to go and check things which you may think is not important, but is actually impacting somebody's life. So it's very hard to say what should we not fact check. If, and again, from a fact checker's perspective, it's never a question of what, it's a question of when and we will do it.
Yes, great answer. I have nothing to add to this. Right, that question about, is that a fair question in a sense? Would you say that they're two completely opposite things, and or are they more aligned than one things? Thinking of fact checking as a public service versus monetizing something and running it as a company.
Yeah. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer in this. And this is a larger question of something I've been thinking about for a while in just terms of how the media industry is positioned and what role they play in society. And even when I look at media literacy, uh, at least a lot of the efforts that I've known, sure, there are sponsors that are there, but to the end user, it has to be free. Because at the end of the day, you want every internet user in this country to know what information should be trusted and also build resilience to misinformation at the same time. And there is a responsibility that we all have as fact checkers or other organizations in adjacent spaces to help people with that. Uh, Through the MCA, at least a lot of the programs that we've done around media literacy has all been free for the end user. But there are certain costs that we incur in terms of putting content together, putting modules together, actually traveling to a place where we are able to conduct these trainings. So having a sponsor is a good way to do it. I think the other part of the question, let me just, yeah, how do we balance journalism's ethical responsibilities with tapping into changing consumer goals and demands? I don't, I have a very different answer to this. And I've increasingly seen that media organizations are losing relevance as individuals gain relevance. I'm looking at influencers today on Instagram, for example, who are saying a lot of things which would question and say, is this right? Like, is this guy even saying the right thing? And you know it's not in many, many cases. But they have thousands, in many cases, millions of followers versus somebody who's actually doing very good work out there in putting accurate and credible information. Uh, the consumer landscape, therefore, is changing very completely, and it's forcing a lot of media companies, including fact checkers, to question how they're putting out the fact checks that they do. How do you reach out to more people, and how do you get your point across? And let me give you a very simple challenge that we face. Our videos on YouTube, they are fact checks of misinformation on YouTube. The misinformation remains, the fact check video gets pulled down. Then we are fighting with YouTube's content moderation team to say that we were not spreading the misinformation, we were actually giving the fact check of it. If you're so keen to take down misinformation, take down the misinformation, not our fact check video of it, right? But these are challenges that we face on a daily basis, whereas those spreading misinformation go unchecked. What do you do in such a scenario? Um, and therefore, we constantly say, how do we ensure or how do we make ourselves relevant? Because more people are on social media today. Today, more people consume news on social media than they do on newspapers. So, what can you do? Are people really interested even in consuming accurate or relevant information? The New York Times is a great example, and people say, "Oh yeah, people pay for subscriptions. Look at New York Times." But people are paying for recipes and games. Is it really for New York Times journalism? That's not majority of their audience. So there is a lot of questions we as an industry, as an ecosystem, need to ask and need to change as quickly, because we do stand a chance that we could be irrelevant very soon.
Fair points. There's a test match going on in the Indian subcontinent. And so for those who are here, you will understand my reference about hitting answers or questions for a six. That's just me being, a jokey guy. Two more questions and we'll wrap things up. Three questions, I think. We'll take all three. Habib Rahman says, I'm a fact checker and a researcher. As part of my research, I've been working with a few media literacy projects for the youth, which are found very impactful. I wonder if MCA can also get into any such media literacy initiatives ahead of elections through fact-checking organizations. So, yeah, so that's basically the
Yeah.
question.
A lot of MCA members are currently undertaking media literacy programs. For example, Sach Ka Saathi, which Vishwas News is doing, is one of the programs that are there. I know Boom is doing a lot of programs. I also know Factly and Quint are doing this. In some cases, different demographics. In some cases, it could be journalism schools. In some cases, it's specifically aimed at senior citizens. In some cases, it's being taken to rural areas. So depending on what your interest is, through the MCA, we'd be happy to connect you to organizations who are already working in this space. The MCA is currently working on projects related to the elections, but not necessarily media literacy, but we can connect you to organizations who are currently doing it.
You have Rajneil's email address, so it's right there. You can write to him directly. I'll choose, let me take this question. What are various issues and challenges associated with fact-checking health-related misinformation? How do we tackle them? And then we'll go to the last question.
Okay. So one of the MCA members is THIP, which is the Healthy Indian Project. Their only focus is health misinformation and nothing else. I think with health, what tends to happen is it's sensitive because it directly impacts your well-being. And therefore, one needs to be very certain and also have the expertise to be able to give out the right information. I'll give you an example of what happened during COVID, right? I think we went into lockdown maybe in the latter part of March to 2020, right? Post 23rd of March, I think. There were many doctors who would come and say, this virus is anyway only survives in this weather in tropical heat, the virus will die and go off, then there will be no COVID. And we then went to nearly 2 years. The weather patterns kept changing, but COVID didn't go away. So, in many such cases, you need the right information, the right expertise, the right knowledge to be able to do these fact checks. The other thing about health is, because health is something that's deeply personal, your physiology is not the same as somebody else's physiology. What may work for you may not work for anybody else. Let me give you another example. I had COVID and I took ivermectin. I felt okay. My symptoms were under control. The doctor prescribed ivermectin. But for many other people, ivermectin was a horse medicine which you shouldn't have been taking. And there was a lot of controversy over whether ivermectin should be prescribed or not prescribed. What do you do in such a scenario, right? My lived experience, of course, shouldn't be the matter. Just because I felt okay doesn't mean everybody will feel okay. And also, when you're taking 5 or 6 medicines together, any of it could have made you feel good, right? How do you know it's ivermectin? So you need to understand these cases very closely to see whether there is something you can actually check or whether it's related to your physiology. If whey protein gives me a bloated feeling, it's me, it's not somebody else. But does that mean whey protein gives the bloated feeling to everybody? I don't know. So you also have to keep that in mind with health fact checking, and in terms of what you can definitely prove versus things that may be very individual specific. In India, we also specifically face this challenge with Ayurveda, homeopathy, home cures, because there's not much scientific study or research to prove some of those claims that are there. I think most recently there is one of the claims about this herbal oil which can instantly help your hair regrow again if you're losing hair and things like that. What is And a lot of people, including my mother, have bought that hair oil looking at the ads on social media. And we've also seen the same content being debunked. So what do you do? So that's why, the stakes are much higher when it comes to health.
Yeah, and I also want to highlight the famous case of liver doctor who, in some senses, a polarizing example, but also increasingly popular for debunking a lot of myths surrounding health misinformation. Last question, I'm also interested in the answer for this, Rajneil, because I haven't really paid as much attention to Telegram personally as I should. So right now, most fact checkers are fact checking routinely on Facebook, WhatsApp, and X. What's the scope for fact checkers with platforms like Telegram?
I think there are multiple ways to answer this, and specifically from a Telegram perspective. When the Taylor Swift deepfake case happened a little over a month ago, a lot of people were wondering where those images came from. And there's been a lot of research. Some people say it came on 4chan, 8chan, then it went to Telegram channels. Then from Telegram channels, it came to X. Um, so we definitely need to do a much better job of tracking other platforms than the most popular platforms. But sometimes we're limited by our own bandwidth to be able to track so many. Sometimes we don't have the right tools to be able to track some of these platforms. Also, not all platforms have structured programs for fact checking where you can engage with, and they themselves are providing the tools to you. Having said that, I think uh, fact checkers are increasingly realizing that there might be what's the right word for it? There might be an order in which information, like in the Taylor Swift case, we know, for example, how it exactly played out. So a lot of fact checkers are also investing their time either trying to build tools or have people look into some of the most popular channels, let's say on Telegram, which may be putting out information that's not necessarily true. Uh, we we're also thinking of solutions where we can automatically start tracking any piece of content that comes out on, let's say, the top most popular 100 channels in India. How can we build that system out? So every time somebody shares something, it's coming into the system without us actually having to spend time. When you look at the entire cyberverse, you'll also want to say, what can you do on Reddit? What can you do on YouTube, for example? And we don't realize YouTube is out of the box for most Android users. So even before they get onto WhatsApp, when they log into Google, they're probably getting onto YouTube first. And sometimes those recommendation algorithms it can send you down a rabbit hole. I've been through that many, many times. Uh, so how do you look at these platforms and how do we also engage with some of these platforms to make our jobs easier, our lives easier? Um, can we do more? Of course. Do we have the bandwidth? Not always the case, but we're definitely trying our best to increase the universe of platforms we are tracking and fact checking on.
Fantastic. Some takeaways for me, certainly, I don't know, for those in the audience, is to spend a little more time looking at how one can track this on Telegram. So we're exactly 1 hour past, an hour and 2 minutes past. So we've been very good on time. We've answered 8 questions, Rajneil. This is a very efficient, utilization of our most precious resource. So we have a couple of announcements coming up, but honestly, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time, and you've given us a lot to think about. I think we can't hear you. Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks for inviting me. I hope this was useful and valuable. If any of y'all would like to reach out, there's my email ID. Um, I might not be communicative the next 3 days, but I will definitely respond after that.
Yes, that's fantastic. Rajneil at MCA, what is it? It's right there in the
mcaindia.in.
.in. And I'm assuming you can also find him on various social media. So thank you so much, Rajneil. And exactly like Rajneil, we have another brilliant speaker coming up next Thursday. That is Sudipto Mandal. He's going to talk about how one reaches, the unreachable, and how does one reach underrepresented audiences while at the same time thinking about disinformation. So he comes at it from a like fact-checking organization's perspective, but he comes at it. A journalist's job is essentially to have fact-checking as part of the process, right? So he'll bring that angle in and perspective in. So I look forward to that as well. And thank you all. And do remember, you have to attend 3 of the 4 seminars or webinars to be able to qualify for funding by the International Center for Journalists. And last year we had 3 organizations actually, but 2 organizations from specifically India that got that funding. That was Factly and the Q that is based in Kerala. So please go ahead and ensure that you attend the next 2 at least, because you've already attended this one. And on that note, thank you, everyone.